Welcome to this podcast. It's part of the Cityforum programme on defence and smart power. My name is Stephen Hawker. I'm an associate of Cityforum and will be moderating this conversation. This year's programme looks at global Britain, polarisation, grey zone and hybrid conflict. But we're focusing today on information, disinformation and distortion. These are not new as tools of war. We all know the story of the Trojan horse. George Washington was a master of deception in the War for Independence. That he also said, "Father, I cannot tell a lie," is of course a good early example of fake news. The Russians are past masters at disinformation in wartime, peace, and in the grey space in between. But they're far from alone in using false information to undermine, influence, and to subvert, or for criminal and other malign purposes. The other side of the coin is the apparent ease with which false information can take hold and conspiracy theories can flourish. Outlandish ideas can find fertile ground against the evidence. The digital information revolution has brought us an unimaginable quantity of information, some good, some bad, and ever more imaginative and rapid ways of sharing it. Ready access to information has, however, not brought the wisdom and understanding we might have hoped for. It has provided malevolent actors, whether states, criminals, fanatics or activists, much greater opportunity to manipulate truth, to manufacture and promote untruth, and to influence and undermine. How bad is it, and what can we do about it? These are both simple questions for today. The answers may be more complex. I'm turning first on this to Carl Miller, Research Director of the Centre for the Analysis of Social Media and an author. Carl, are we losing the information war? Can truth set us free, or are we doomed to fake news and increasing polarisation? Can we do anything to limit disinformation and distortion?
I mean, it's pretty bad out there. I don't want to paint too rosy a picture. Now, it's very true to say that information has long been a tool of war. For sure it has. And that's a very good place to begin this discussion. But I do think that kind of an enormously consequential thing quite recently has happened, which actually kind of marks, in my eyes, quite a large difference between the kind of relationship of information and warfare in the past as it is today. A kind of ideational flip has happened. In the past, information was a tool of war, maybe a weapon of war, maybe a tactic of war. Over the last 10 years or so, that's not really, I think, how war fighters see it. They see it increasingly as a theatre of war, a space that war happens within. Of course, in a sense, metaphorically at first, but increasingly, actually, that metaphor has become a practical reality. And I think that is enormously consequential when we actually now consider what's really happening. Militaries, intelligence agencies, and then so many other different actors around the world see information as a space where conflict happens within, that they need to wage war within, that they need to dominate, that they need to defeat their enemies within. And that changes, I think, as an idea, I think that changes almost everything. Because suddenly all of our psychologies become a kind of, a strategy, of war. All of our attention becomes the territory of war. And information itself becomes militarized. And as it becomes militarized, I think it becomes instrumentalized. So it doesn't become something which in and of itself has value, in and of itself is a kind of creation and product and treasure of our culture. It becomes something that only really is valuable when it has an ulterior purpose, when it either changes the way that someone behaves or what they think. I think that really is the principal consequence of militarizing information. And that idea of seeing information as a space, I think that's happening almost everywhere. It's definitely happening between states and geopolitics, but it's happening probably also as significantly across a very large array of actors that kind of are radically rejecting the status quo. And the status quo in science, as I'm sure Angela will talk about, the status quo in politics, in health, and in doing so is kind of being used as a way of attacking the mainstream in ways which are really important. I think that's where we're currently finding ourselves in, and that kind of means, in a way, I think we're losing the war in two ways then. Like, we're losing the war in the sense that liberal democratic actors, scientists, mainstream journalists are far less free to operate in this space, to fight in this space. But then also we're losing it even when we do, in a way, kind of militarize ourselves. So as we kind of, in a way, like, I think this is happening, like, feel like information is inevitably going to be militarized and therefore we need to militarize it as well, we lose the wider conflict, where we too simply kind of view it as an instrument for behavioral attitudinal change. And that drains a lot of the most valuable things of information away from it. That's why. So on both of those two levels of the battlefield, I think we are losing. Yeah.
Okay, we might come back to the idea that, particularly in the West, we're fighting with one hand behind our backs on this. But before we go into discussion, I want to hear from Bret and from Angela. So, Bret Schafer, Media and Digital Disinformation Fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy. I mean, Bret, recent polls suggest increasing dissatisfaction with democracy and democratic processes, particularly amongst the young. Is this the result of the disinformation onslaught? And is this how democracy dies?
I don't know if it's necessarily directly a result of disinformation, but of course they work in parallel. So you see many different factors that actually feed into disinformation narratives are the ones that are contributing to this lack of trust in democracy and democratic institutions. And I think what is challenging for democracies and what makes this sort of an asymmetric advantage for authoritarians is when you look at disinformation, it can do two things, right? It can motivate people to action or it can motivate people to inaction. And we spend a lot of time thinking about motivating factors in terms of action, turning people out in the streets, radicalizing people. That's obviously a huge concern. I mean, we're seeing this right now in the United States with some of the far right groups that are showing up at polling stations. We're seeing this in conflicts in the street. What I am particularly concerned about, though, is the other group, the group that's being motivated to inaction. So they look at the world around them and they don't know what's true and what's not true and what to believe and what not to believe. And I think that erosion of trust leads many to just become apathetic, to say, I don't know what's happening in the world around me. It's too complicated. I don't really see the incentive to become involved in the democratic process. And so people sort of tune out. When I spent time in Russia, that's really what I saw disinformation doing there. It wasn't that people really bought into the Kremlin line. It's that they bought into the Kremlin line that everybody was lying. So when you reach that point where you're convinced that the world around you is manufactured by elites or the media or whomever else, and that you can't actually trust the reality outside of your own neighborhood, that leads people to be apathetic. If you're an authoritarian, that of course is a great thing. You want an apathetic society. You don't want people in the streets. But if you're trying to run a democracy, if you have an apathetic population, that's just incredibly damaging. So I think when we talk about the asymmetric advantage, we have to look at that. Authoritarians benefit from disinformation at home because it creates a population that doesn't know what to trust, that kind of tunes out from the political process. But when you have an apathetic population in a democracy, people stop voting, people stop, taking an active role in society. That's hugely consequential and obviously very damaging to democracies and to democratic institutions.
Thank you, Bret. It provides a very good link into what I think Angela is going to talk about in terms of damage to trust, in your case, going to apathy. But turning then to you, Angela. Angela Saini is an award-winning science writer and journalist. And Angela, a recent Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism poll suggests that trust in government and in new organisations has been a major casualty of the pandemic. Interestingly, faith in what scientists say has held up slightly better. But given all that, there's plenty of noise from pandemic deniers and anti-vaxxers. I mean, is there a particular problem about untruths dressed up in scientific clothing? I mean, are there particular problems peculiar to the science world?
Well, there have always been people who have doubted what scientists tell us. So there have always been conspiracy theories within the sciences among the public. But I think what we're seeing now is it's so much easier for those conspiracy theorists to gain followers. And while that may seem not much of a problem because, if they're fringe groups, then what difference does it make? If you have large enough numbers, it can have an impact, for example, on public health. So this is what you see in the anti-vaccination movement, is that what started off relatively small grew and grew, fed, I have to say, in part by certain scientists on the fringes of academia. So, for example, Andrew Wakefield, who fed this idea at the beginning that there was a link between the MMR vaccine and autism. So there are legitimate figures within those kind of movements, but then the movements build around them and they play on people's fears, legitimate fears, I think, sometimes the fear for your child's safety, for instance. And if you don't have enough of a proportion of people in a population being vaccinated, that creates a threat. It's a public health problem. So even fringe groups then can have an impact on these kind of things. And I think more broadly, if we're talking about undermining trust in authority and eroding that kind of basic belief that we have that doctors are doing what they do in our best interests, that the health departments of our governments are doing what they do in our best interest. If we no longer trust that, then the machinery of government doesn't work in the same way anymore. The machinery of public health systems doesn't work in the same way anymore. And it kind of, the whole fabric of society then gets torn down in small ways. So I think it comes back to this idea of mistrust of authority. I think that's essentially what these conspiracy theories within science do, is that we may feel that scientists are the most trustworthy people, but if that is where we're headed, that we can't even trust scientists anymore, then we're left with really nothing at all. And that's not to say that scientists haven't done some of that damage themselves. They have. There is sometimes very poor communication of uncertainty, for instance, or of admission when things go wrong. And we've certainly seen a lot of that during this year in the pandemic. So I think there are lots of people to blame. But what the actors within the disinformation sphere do is they play on that and they use that as one of their tools to whip up greater fear and anxiety about what's going on around people. So for me, trust in science and scientific misinformation or pseudoscience is an existential issue. It really does undermine the work of states in trying to keep people safe and healthy.
Just staying with that thought for the moment, is it possible that scientists are just rather poor at explaining themselves?
Well, the problem is that science itself is uncertain, and that's not scientists' fault. That's just how the process is. We can't know everything at the beginning. So at the start of the pandemic, everybody wanted answers very quickly. We just literally did not have them. We don't have enough data to give people the answers that they need. And then when you get kind of conflicting advice, for example, on mask wearing, which there was a lot of conflicting advice at the beginning, and now it's a lot clearer, that erodes trust in science because people think that scientists don't know what they're doing. They don't know what to tell us. And so how can they know what they're doing? I think what we're missing in society is public understanding of how the scientific process works. And actually you can't have answers straight away. It takes time to get answers, and scientists will get things wrong, and that's okay as long as they get there eventually. And that we do, as we get more data, then we can understand things better. But of course on social media, where a lot of this speculation happens, there's no room for that kind of nuance or explanation. There's no space to explain how slowly things work. People want very black and white answers immediately, and I'm afraid science doesn't work that way.
Perhaps we can go back then to the fundamental question of what we need to do about this. And perhaps if I go back to Carl, first of all. Carl, what weapons do we have? Or are we doomed to lose it? Because as democracies with free speech, we are literally fighting with one hand behind our backs.
Well, I certainly think that liberal democratic militaries feel like that. They certainly have nothing like the kind of license to operate that any autocratic military has here. So I think there's a great deal of frustration, really, if you talk to people in defence and national security, that they see the information space, as they will call it too, the area where conflict seems to be most dynamic and energetic. And it's the one where they feel like they can actually protect people and fulfill their mandate the least. So I certainly think for militaries specifically, like understanding a little clearer what the rules of engagement are for a liberal democratic military, I think would be really helpful. And it's not to say like that the West has not built their own cyber offensive capabilities or information warfare capabilities. They have. You go down to the 77th Brigade. There is an entire brigade that fights information warfare. On what terms and on what basis, from a legal and ethical point of view, I think can be made much more explicit, which will help them do more. But then outside of the military, which is never going to be the principal way in which a democracy responds to this kind of thing, there has been really a huge effort in quite a narrow way. So in the run-up to the US elections, it might be the most informationally attacked event in history, but it's certainly the most informationally defended event in history as well. I've never seen the sheer scale of civic society organisations and journalists and researchers and academics coming together to kind of try and expose the various nefarious attempts to undermine the election like this. The attempt is absolutely enormous. If you actually boil it down, the actual strategy is pretty narrow. Academics or think tanks doing research, usually working with journalists, leading to journalistic expose of a campaign, quite often then tacked onto platform advocacy to get the thing taken down. And then the kind of platforms, Facebook and Twitter and so on, will then, do their own investigations internally and announce when it's taken down. We should be so much more creative in trying to expand the universe of possible ways of responding to all of this and beyond that. Because ultimately that process is important, it is, but it really only ever leads to stuff being taken down from a platform, which really doesn't actually hurt the perpetrators of this very much at all. It's just like kind of, but I imagine budgeted into the kind of occupational hazards of doing it. There's a wide array of other things, which I don't think we've tried very much of yet. I don't want to talk too long now and kind of list them all exhaustively to you, but let me throw a couple your way. Informational activism might be one. When civic society and activist groups are thinking about how to be involved, well, there's all these places online where these kinds of campaigns are often organised and coordinated, and activist groups might say, okay, well, if you're going to coordinate information campaigns in these places, we're going to turn up, and we're going to protest. And we're going to make it more difficult and more costly and more annoying for you to kind of coordinate campaigns in this particular area. I think for journalists, we have to do much more in not just writing about the actual content that we see. Because, you throw a stone onto the social media platforms at the moment and you'll hit some kind of weird campaign. Simply reporting on that campaign actually doesn't do very much. It doesn't levy many costs, and it runs the danger of actually just simply amplifying it. We have to get much, much better at digging deeper to kind of expose the real interests and people involved. There are dodgy PR companies that are going around pitching these kinds of campaigns. We need to work out who they are. We need to sting them. We need to get their sales decks. We need to expose the kind of money trails that will lead from states to PR companies to deniable online assets to campaigns. We got to dig deeper because in doing that, we can expose the real stories and actually help with attribution. And we're doing much less of that than we need to be. And we're doing much more of simply writing about the campaigns than we should be, I think, as a profession.
Okay, so, at the heart of that is this idea of raising the costs for adversaries. Moving to you, Bret, do you recognise the picture that Carl has just painted of what it feels like to be in the States at the moment prior to the election? And what do you think we need to do to try and stem the tide?
Absolutely. It's a complete mess here right now. It's just almost impossible to try to quantify how much disinformation is out there because it's coming from so many different directions. But I think Carl's point is one that I've stressed many times. We've relied too heavily on Facebook and Twitter and Google to be the police of the internet. And, clearly they have an outsized role in policing disinformation on their platforms. But the worst they can do is take content down. And at the end of the day, that is not a huge disincentive to threat actors who are trying to run disinformation campaigns. There is really no cost there. Yes, they lose some assets, they have to rebuild them, but that is a pretty minor penalty in the grand scheme of things. So I think there needs to be much more of an emphasis on law enforcement solutions to this. As Carl mentioned, there are PR firms, and not just PR firms working out of Belarus and the Philippines. There are PR firms in the United States that are running disinformation campaigns in other countries. They need to be hammered when they're caught, and they have been caught. And not enough attention has been given to how we go after these sort of nests of disinformation. How do we disrupt things where they're actually happening? When we see it on a platform, and you take accounts down, that's not disrupting them at the sort of source. It's already out there at that point. So how do you raise the cost? I think one thing you can do is you start leveling sanctions against countries that are running these kind of campaigns. We've done that to a degree in the United States, but it clearly has not been particularly effective. But two, as has been mentioned, there are many private companies who are now sort of disinformation services for hire. And there are ways to go at asset forfeiture, to start pulling in things like consumer fraud protection. There are many different legal mechanisms that can be used to start snuffing out some of these companies who are just doing it for profit. Now, the Russians are going to do what the Russians are going to do, and the Chinese are going to do what the Chinese are going to do. And there are things we can do to disrupt, to a degree, state-backed efforts. But one way that would really help in terms of focusing our attention there is if we start picking off all of these different people online who are doing it purely for profit And the way you go after people who are doing it for profit is you make it less profitable. And so I think there are several options that we have. There have been a few cases. There's a company called Devumi in the United States that was running, essentially this sort of celebrity Instagram fake engagement kind of factory. And the state of New York, the state of Florida went after them very hard. The FTC went after them hard. They put them out of business. We need to do more of that so that we kind of shrink the community of bad actors down to the people who are really just motivated because of some ideological reason or state-backed actors. And that would give, I think, our military and just civil society, as well as the diplomatic corps, more ability to focus on the state-backed actors when you're just kind of eliminating all of the people on the periphery who are doing it for profit.
Thank you. Angela, to put the question to you in perhaps a slightly different way, what about us, the users, the readers, the consumers of all this? What can we do about ourselves or the way that we react to information and false information?
I completely agree with Carl and Bret that we need to kind of go to the sources of disinformation, expose them, understand them, and have tighter regulation and legal mechanisms to close them down. The other question then is, why do people become susceptible to these ideas? Why do they fall into these traps? And this is, I think, far more a psychological question. So a lot of, for example, scientific misinformation, anti-misinformation initiatives focus on fact-checking, just putting out accurate facts. So, for example, Instagram, if you search for anti-vaccine content, they will flag it and say, here is some reliable content around vaccinations. The problem with that is that a lot of these people who are searching out this kind of content already know that that exists. They're deliberately choosing not to read it, or they've already read it and they're choosing not to believe it. So this is, I think, far less about facts and more about narratives that are built around certain worldviews for which science or some other kind of pseudoscientific information or data or certain intellectual sources become fodder. And it's those narratives that we have to address. Because I think, frankly, one of the reasons that people are drawn into these rabbit holes is not that they're stupid or poorly educated. And certainly in the circles that I've looked in, people are sometimes very well educated. They have all the information available. They've read much of the information. In fact, they may have read more than many of us. But they're choosing to believe something else because of some fundamental dissatisfaction they have with the way that society works, or an experience they've had, for example, a bad experience with a doctor or the medical profession, or they no longer trust the government because they read about, politicians doing dodgy things. And that kind of is legitimate. Those fears are legitimate fears. And this is about how strong and reliable democracy is, and whether institutions and establishments are working in ways that foster trust. And I fear that one of the reasons that we're seeing this rise of loss of trust in authority and therefore the rise of these kind of conspiracy theories is partly because people are just losing faith in the big institutions that previously were not questioned so much. The internet has allowed us to question them more than we did before.
Thank you. I've heard Carl talk before about bubbles and echo chambers, and the wish that I suspect is in all of us to associate with people of similar views and a resistance to hearing alternatives, and the sense too that we might have hoped that good information drives out the bad, but sadly it may be that bad information is more fun and it tends to crowd out the good. But we're coming towards the end of our time, I think, and what I would like to do is to ask each of you in turn, and before I wind up, for a couple of sort of final thoughts of things either that you've heard today or that you think we really need to do something about, or that we should take away from here and act on. I'll turn to Carl first.
The most important realisation, I think, to leave people with is with the nature of the problem really to begin with, because I think we haven't even really got that right yet. I don't really think that the issue here is fake news or disinformation per se. I think what we're dealing with is the illicit inaction of influence using the internet in ways which is very concerted and strategized, of which fake news or disinformation can be a part. But when you actually pull apart campaigns from, I'm talking specifically state-based here, but if you pull apart the campaigns from, say, Russia or China or Iran or the Philippines, quite often, actually, the campaigns aren't really trying. They're certainly not doing what I think maybe people listening to this might suspect that a campaign is trying to do, which is to lie to people to get them to change their beliefs about something. Far more frequently, they are simply trying to confirm a picture of the world that people already think is true, and then make them more angry about it, and then try and funnel that anger in a particular direction. That is a much more effective and easier influence model. And in doing that, you often don't need to lie to people. You actually just need to cherry pick a series of truths and paint a very distorted picture of the world that way. In a world as noisy as the one that we find ourselves in today, this isn't really about creating lies. It's about trying to make some truths more visible than others. That's really where the power is. The power is in massaging and manipulating attention and visibility. So the problem then is how that happens. It's not with the fact that people are using social media to create lies and somehow propagate them. And that really, I think, kind of blows this kind of rational actor model completely out of the water. It's kind of dominated the kind of, especially the academic study of this for far too long. The idea that what we're really dealing with here is, you know, that someone is lying to someone and they don't have the skills to spot it's a lie, and they therefore, in this weirdly Bayesian way, kind of inappropriately adjust their beliefs about the world in response to that inappropriately believed lie. It's just that just isn't what is at play. We're dealing with identity, we're dealing with senses of belonging, we're dealing with people genuinely feeling like they're exposing truths about the world, and we're dealing with states that have far more subtle influence strategies and all of that. And that means then, before we do anything else, we need to unlock ourselves from the series of reactions to this problem that I think that we have been stuck in now for the last couple of years. We need to get ourselves out of fact-checking. We need to get ourselves out of the idea that teaching digital literacy is going to be the way out. And I think we need to get out of the idea that we are all not vulnerable to this because we really are good at spotting the lies from truthers. It's when each of us is nodding our heads, that's when we're most vulnerable.
Okay, thank you. Bret.
I would just want to quickly piggyback on what Carl said there, because I think that has been one of the big problems in how we fight this, is we have looked for instances of fake news and disinformation and looked at that as being sort of the gold standard of how do we somehow flush those off social media platforms. The most effective campaigns, as he mentioned, are campaigns that are largely, if not entirely, truthful. Now, they're giving a manipulated perception of reality for sure. But if you look at certain websites that, for example, have tried to create the perception of there being mass migration problems and problems around immigration in certain communities, for the most part, they are just cherry picking real events. I mean, there's a website in Europe called Voice of Europe that all it does is sort of publish stories about migrant rapes and, the Islamification of Europe and all of these things. If you look at each individual story, to a degree, almost all of it is objectively true. What is not true is kind of the reality that they have created. And that's the problem on social media, is that the realities that are created for us there just don't really reflect reality, but they do for many people. I mean, I think that's the problem, is that it feeds into what people perceive to be the reality. So it's not so much, as he said, that it's like radically changing our view of the world. No, it's reinforcing our view of the world, but it's doing it every single day and countless times per day. So when you used to tune into the 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock news, you'd see some things that would reinforce your view of the world. Now you're just bombarded by it at all times. So I think when we look to solutions, the first thing is there is not a solution. There has to be many, 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 many different solutions here that starts chipping away at the problem. But we're not going to have a silver bullet. This is not going to go away. I mean, particularly, again, in a democratic society where we want sort of free flows of information. So we just have to look at things to start mitigating certain threats, try to minimize the threat that's out there. But it's just not going to go away. And there's no silver bullet. And again, if we continue to look at this as a fake news problem or a disinformation problem, we're going to be totally lost, because the most effective campaigns, again, are at least based at some level in truth. So we have to kind of completely rethink how we approach this.
Angela.
I left Twitter at the beginning of this year. So the type of topics I write on gender and race. And so I'm an automatic target there especially from white supremacist groups and far right groups. But in that 6-7 months since I've left, I've noticed myself becoming a far more reasonable, moderate person. I can physically feel it. I can feel my brain kind of changing over those months. It was quite difficult at the beginning. And I think this is what these social media platforms do. They force you constantly, every 5 minutes, to take very binary positions on everything. And I think in the real world, most people, and most people are not on Twitter all the time, have quite nuanced, unsubstantiated, kind of unformed views and opinions about most things. And that is how real democracy should work, that we should be thinking through things, having conversations with our friends, having conversations with others, consuming a variety of media. This is why I think that, personally, I feel social media is so dangerous when it comes to these problems. It can be beneficial in other ways, but when it comes to this problem, I think it's so dangerous because it psychologically turns us into different people that we're not. And I think that is the power of these platforms, to be used by state actors or people who want to sow discord or division in societies, is that they are aided by these particular platforms. And I can't think of anything more useful that we can do if we really want to fight it than leave, to be honest. That's my view.
Okay, thank you. And on that note, I am going to draw this to a close. I mean, clearly there is an information war, and as Carl has said, the battlefield is growing. I think the most cogent thing I've heard today is this sense that it isn't necessarily untruth that we're fighting, but the selective and manipulative use of truth. And I think that is something that we need to think further about. My last quote, I think, is going to be from Carl in an article he wrote, that we're in a struggle over belief, truth, identity, and emotion in the digital age. So it's not about the technology or the information, it's more fundamental than that. But I must bring this to close, so I would like to thank all three of you for your cogent contributions. I would like to thank Cityforum for putting the event together, and a particular thank you to our principal sponsors, BAE Systems, for their support, because without them, such events as this could not take place. So thank you very much, everybody.